This is a story of societies falling and rising. This is a story of lives beginning and ending, a story of an entire species fading away. Stories, for good or ill, live on in the generations that follow. If we learn from the past, we reshape the narrative of the world over time. In writer and artist Jeff Lemire's Sweet Tooth, what few people remain after an apocalyptic plague has ended life as we know it are given the chance to change humanity's narrative for a new people. The question is, can the cycle of violence and hate ingrained in us for millennia be stopped to make that change? Written and drawn by Jeff Lemire, with colors by Jose Villarrubia and letters by Pat Brousseau, Sweet Tooth ran for 40 issues under DC Comics' Vertigo imprint from September 2009 through January 2013. In it, we follow Gus, a 9-year-old deer-human hybrid boy surviving in the American wilderness after almost all of humanity has been killed by a mysterious plague. As society fell apart amidst mankind's rapid desolation, hybrid children were born around the world with an immunity to the disease. Sweet Tooth starts nearly a decade after the apocalypse began, as Gus's father dies, and our young protagonist is taken in by Jepperd, a rough and dangerous man with unclear designs for Gus. Together with a growing group of survivors, Gus and Jepperd try to understand what it means to trust and care for others in an incredibly brutal world. The choices they make will not only save and condemn many, but reshape the future of humanity and hybrid. Sweet Tooth is a post-apocalyptic survival story centered in the American Midwest, a tightly contained piece of genre storytelling that balances fantastical ideas with very small-scale drama. But beyond its grisly fights, tragic deaths, and numerous moments of tenderness, Sweet Tooth is ultimately about the stories that people create, and the lessons these stories impart to others long after those people are gone. The self-reflexive act of a story calling attention to the importance of stories means that Sweet Tooth is intently focused on reminding its readers that they themselves are just a small part of the larger narrative of the world. Lemire accomplishes this through Sweet Tooth's structure, mysterious plague, and character dynamics. Regarding Sweet Tooth's recurring motif of stories, Lemire reflected, "If I look at my original outlines that I have for Sweet Tooth, or my original pitch, that was always there, and it even repeated at the end. Originally, that came from the idea that, in some of the earlier issues, there were stories about the deer and the rabbit that were following him around, the Disney kind of characters. Then I did those issues that were supposed to feel like children's books. So the idea was that this book is about stories, and then maybe they were part of a bigger story too. That was always part of it." The story of Sweet Tooth is given ample room to breathe over the span of 40 issues. But Lemire uses this length not to broaden his world, but instead to experiment with storytelling style and structure. Individual issues frequently break from the established presentation to remind viewers of how the same story can be told in many different ways. "I'm a huge fan of post-apocalyptic stories," said Lemire. "Sweet Tooth is my version of a post-apocalyptic tale. It's a surreal fairy tale for adults." The majority of Sweet Tooth is told from an omniscient perspective with occasional inner monologues. But Lemire breaks from formula so frequently that the reader begins to expect that these sudden shifts in format could happen during any issue. Every so often, an issue will use caption boxes for Gus or Jepperd's thoughts, giving readers the chance to understand their two leads, especially the hardened but secretly broken Jepperd. Punching, kicking, biting, anything to survive. But what happens when the world goes quiet? Empty. What happens when there's no one left to fight? Yeah, I could always fight. It's the rest of it I ain't never been good at. Gus's dreams become the key to understanding his growth as a child and the future of Sweet Tooth's world. Bambi and Thumper-like characters represent his innocence, which is killed by Jepperd's interference in his life. Eventually, the moments he sees in his visions and the choices he makes within his dreams determine who lives and who dies throughout the story. "My daddy told me to never, ever leave the woods. He said the world outside was nothing but sinners and demons and bad people doing bad things to one another. But then the sick got him, and I was all alone. Then Mr. Jepperd came, and he was tough and strong, and I trusted him, and I finally left the deep woods. For a while, I thought my daddy was wrong. I thought there was still good in the world. But now I see that he was right. It's only sadness and death outside, and now I'm stuck in it too." Multiple issues titled The Sing Tapes show the clinical perspective of the scientist Dr. Singh and highlight the limitations of science in this potentially supernatural apocalypse, as well as that character's slow shift from man of science to man of faith. Religion becomes a recurring theme throughout, beginning with the strange form of Christianity taught to Gus by his father, and extending to the Native American symbols used throughout his visions. These things I have seen in my dreams. These are the things I know. These things will happen. How it finishes, I don't know. I am not the one to write the final page. I think the use of religion is about trying to find some universal truth about spirituality that we can all embrace, said Lemire. No matter what religion you come from, there are certain things in common among all religions. This idea that we're all connected, or the idea of returning to nature, which I think is a very spiritual idea. Other issues give different side characters an extended backstory through their recollections of the past, with these entries frequently brought to life by guest illustrators. Close to the end, the three-part story of The Taxidermist details the journal entries of an early 20th century expedition that sheds light on the plague's origins. The lead character of that story is an explorer whose scientifically frustrated writings eventually inspire the religious ramblings of Gus's father. Gus's father's writings in turn influence Sing's spiritual spiral. Stories within stories, beliefs inspiring beliefs. Humanity's end is inevitable in the story of Sweet Tooth. But which stories survive with the hybrids is a decision its characters must make for themselves. 2 times, Lemire flips the book on its side for the continuing adventures of the boy and the big man, giving Sweet Tooth a children's bedtime story feel written in prose. These issues highlight brief moments of tenderness removed from the continual dangers faced in the rest of the comic, and seen from a more innocent perspective. Lemire's art is flat, raw, and sharp, but not without its charms. His characters can feel like paper cutouts, but still maintain warmth and visual distinction from one another. But where Lemire really shines is in his layouts. The artist frequently uses cinematically framed close-ups to really emphasize emotions, and specifically juxtaposes page layouts against one another to draw the reader's attention to a single character, or a moment that will have lasting repercussions in the story. Every so often, the outline of a character will shape the page, or a single character will be imposed upon a larger spread, highlighting them as the greatest influence on the choices being made at that moment. Dreams and hallucinations give Lemire the chance to shift his structure even more as the panels blur together, and the line between reality and prophecy begins to fade. Meanwhile, Villarrubia's colors shift to a splotchy watercolor approach when reality warps. Lemire makes these massively stylish choices at very specific moments in the story, with a very simple page layout used most of the time, so that these changes pop off the page even more. Having the reader become aware of the storytelling choices made throughout means that they will frequently be pulled out of the story to better see the artifice of it all. Lemire uses this to bring attention to the fact that yes, this is a story. Gus and Jepperd may be the focus of Sweet Tooth, but Lemire frequently shifts focus to the many supporting characters around them, like survivors Becky and Lucy, fellow hybrids Wendy and Bobby, morally gray scientist Sing, and even the true villain of the story, Abbott. The many different perspectives cast this post-apocalyptic saga in a variety of lights, but from any viewpoint, the story of Sweet Tooth is about humanity's narrative coming to an end by forces they can't control, and a new story beginning, the story of the hybrids. Given these many different perspectives, Lemire threads supernatural elements throughout Sweet Tooth's rundown post-apocalypse without ever completely defining the line between the scientific and the spiritual. The world Lemire builds continuously blends the two, with prophetic visions guiding many of the characters, while men of science attempt to understand the plague that killed humanity. The reasons behind the apocalypse are given some explanation by its end, but Sweet Tooth largely leaves it up to readers to interpret where myth and reality intersect in the plague's origin. However, in this battle between the science of dying humanity and the spirituality directly connected to the hybrids, Sweet Tooth definitively shows the hybrids to be the winning side by its end. Sweet Tooth is about going back to that idea that we're all connected, and getting back to a simpler way of life. Gus and the hybrid kids really represent that. They're the innocence of childhood. Sweet Tooth is about the world returning to that kind of place. Sweet Tooth is the story of young Gus and old Jepperd, and how these two lost souls change each other and the world. This intimate focus becomes a microcosm of the larger world, and, in the end, is about the sacrifices needed to reshape humanity's narrative. Gus is at the center of that reshaping of the world. Gus, whose innocence from being raised far away from the post-apocalyptic world is what sparks this story. While he slowly loses that innocence over time, Gus's pure heart remains intact and influences people like Jepperd and Sing to change their ways. I am sort of pessimistic in that way, where I often think the worst of people, Lemire admitted. So when you create a character like Gus, it's maybe some way of me processing that pessimism and giving some hope at the end of all of it. And maybe it's not all hopeless. And maybe we have to remember that innocence we all have when we're kids. Maybe there's something magical about that we lose as we get older. Gus himself becomes a story pieced together by the many he comes to know and love in Sweet Tooth, with Jepperd being the greatest influence of all. Jepperd's strengths and sacrifices live on in the young boy who becomes a man, while still leaving humanity's darkest impulses behind. Likewise, Jepperd, who once viewed his own story as one of death and misery reaching its bitter end, finds a reason to live because of his love for the hybrids. At Sweet Tooth's end, both readers and survivors must admit that the mystery of the plague will never fully be solved, and that the hybrids, once thought of as the great threat to humanity, are the inheritors of the Earth. These hybrids are the next generation, and just like each parent must do with their own child, the few remaining survivors must decide what they pass on through the stories they inevitably become. An older Gus later reflects, "Man's time was done. They had their chance to live in harmony with the land, and they failed. Then we were born, the hybrid. We are one with the land, one with the animals that walk it. But we also carry mankind's legacy in our blood and bones, so that we never forget that we are no better than they. We too can fall. We too can fail. We must never forget the face of the gods, as man did." As issue 40 brings Sweet Tooth to a bittersweet close, Lemire repeatedly leaps readers forward in time, seeing how the actions of Gus, Jepperd, and their found family ripple through the new world. All the while, Lemire's narration reminds us of how these moments become stories that shape even larger stories, redefining the world's narrative for a better future. The story we've read for 39 issues is selectively passed on to Gus's children and far beyond. All that remains of humanity by the end of Sweet Tooth is the story told of them to the hybrids. This is a story. This is a story of a little boy with antlers who lived alone in the woods. This is a story of war, the final war. And this is a story of compassion. This is a story. This is the story of a little boy with antlers who grew into a man. And this is the story of the woman who loved him. But it wasn't just their story. This is also a story of remembrance, because they knew to forget how they had gotten here, to forget the sacrifices made to get them here, would mean to repeat the mistakes of man. Despite their differences, despite their scars, they all stood together once a year and remembered. They remembered their fathers, and they remembered themselves. They weren't just strangers bound by history and fate. They were family, and this was their story. Sweet Tooth is a story of a story. Eventually, we become stories too. What will yours say when you're gone?